Great.
All right, thanks for coming today, and I'll turn things over to Kristine.
Yes, thanks. Thank you for coming. And I'm excited. We are a small but mighty group. And as I always have told my students, when I have small groups and many people are absent, they'll say, "Are we still going to have class?" Yes, absolutely. And you're going to get 5 times as many opportunities to interact. So I'm really excited. And this is being recorded as well. So welcome to Text Complexity: What, Why, and How. And this is a brand new webinar that I've created. So I'm excited about it. And I am Kristine Kelly, and I am the Atlas Literacy Coordinator. I may have met you in person or maybe have not had a chance to meet you because of COVID. I know some of you I recognize from the EBRI webinars. So welcome. It's great to have everyone here. So our objectives today is we're going to identify what text complexity is, why it's important for learners. It's really important for our adults. We're going to talk a little bit about background knowledge and pre-teaching, which has been a really interesting topic of discussion ever since the College and Career Readiness Standards for Adults dropped in 2014. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to identify some instructional scaffolds to mediate complex text, and no doubt you already have some wonderful scaffolds that you use. You have an opportunity to talk about those. And then we're going to look at a text set. We're actually going to look at 2 text sets. At Language and Lit, I talked a little bit about a text set. I'm going to give an example of a lower and a higher level text set and how text sets are related to increasing text complexity for a group of students. I know that Patsy and Lindsay can watch the chat box for me. I will also be watching the chat box. I will be asking you for your input in quite a few places during this webinar. So our agenda: a little bit about text complexity, a little bit about support, text sets, and then we will wrap up for the day. So let's get started. What is text complexity and why is it important? Well, this is a key anchor concept, actually, for the College and Career Readiness Standards. And we've been talking about text complexity for a long time. But about 6 months ago, I attended a really excellent webinar put on the East Coast, and it was about text complexity, and it kind of brought this to the forefront again, and it got me really excited. So when we talk about text complexity, we measure that in 3 different ways. And those ways are using a quantitative scale. This is when we use a computer, and computers have algorithms. They most often measure text by length of words, frequency of words, length of sentences, number of paragraphs, lengths of paragraphs. And so computers actually see and measure. The second way that we measure text complexity is us, professional evaluation. And we look at qualitative features such as language, complexity of sentences, what background knowledge is assumed by the writer, a purpose, is it implied, is it stated, visuals and how the visuals interact with the text. Are they just extra or do they add additional information? And this is something that we do. And then finally, we also do the reader and task. And the reader and the task is our judgment then of who we have in front of us. So we then take, a quantitative number, and then we take what we have learned about what features might be complex or seem to be complex. Then we look at the students in front of us and we go, what about this particular group? Or what about this student? Perhaps there is a complexity with background knowledge for somebody just coming to the text, but maybe you've already done other instruction that has developed this background knowledge, or you're giving something to a group that already comes to you with background knowledge. That means that feature is not going to be as complex for that particular group of students. So that's the final step in this, is we think about who's in front of us. There is no single source of information that can accurately summarize the complexity of a text. We can use publisher materials, and the publisher can say, this is geared at a third grade level, or this is geared for high beginning ESL, or this is geared for the GED prep student. But within that, there's different levels of complexity within one grade level. Of course, you have, if for those of you who've taught in the K-12 system, you might have a second grade class or an 11th grade class. And there's a really big range in materials. So text complexity, this is anchor 10 in the blue College and Career Readiness for Adults book, and it looks different than any other English language arts standard. And it has numbers, it has ranges. And so we have goals that students should be reading independently. That's a goal within an appropriate band. And it's something that we work toward. There's a lower number and a higher number. The lower number, that's basically, where students are going to maybe have an easier time, as opposed to moving up. And the bands overlap as well. So if you're working with students on, say, intermediate, low, and high intermediate students, potentially, or low intermediate students on a level C band, by the time they get to the upper part of that band, they're actually moving into the level D band. So this just gives us ranges. And in Minnesota, we do not use reading maturity. That disappeared. That was originally with Pearson, and then it went away. And then the Flesch-Kincaid is what comes with Microsoft Word. The problem with that is that there is no oversight to Flesch-Kincaid within Word. So it changes when Word changes. And it's been found to not be necessarily completely accurate. So that leaves us with 4 other means. The degrees of reading power is based on a test that you purchase. SourceRater, I believe SourceRater is also pay. So we have landed in Minnesota on the ATOS and the Lexile framework. ATOS is the easiest. You can just drop any text right into the analyzer. You don't even need an account, a free account. Lexile, you do need a free account, and you can get a range of numbers. And at the end, if you have any questions about how to access those and use them, I'm happy if you email me to give you that information. So we want students to work throughout a range depending on the task and the purpose. One note, if you are working with learners who are at level A of the CCRS, that's everywhere from I've never held a pencil and I'm not even sure about reading left to right in English, okay, all the way up into the end of level A, where students are reading connected text, might be short sentences, short paragraphs. One of my colleagues once said, it's all complex. At that level, students are really working on mastering decoding skills. We don't run that text through the computer. We don't run it for a quantitative analysis. We can, however, look at the qualitative features and consider our students. And we also don't use a computer. We don't use ATOS or Lexile for obviously visuals, song lyrics, poems, literature, because quantitative computer algorithms do not measure layers of meaning at all. So you might have a poem that's very, very difficult, but the computer is simply measuring seeing short sentences and maybe stanzas. So it's reading them as paragraphs, and it gives it like a first grade reading level. Well, that's not going to work with poetry, obviously, because poetry has many levels of meaning. So what are some features that make a text complex, in your opinion? I want you to go ahead in the chat box and what makes it complex? Think about your students, think about your own reading. And when you're reading something, you're like, whew, this isn't easy. What are some things that make a text complex? Oh, vocabulary, sentence length, punctuation. I have read that when a sentence is longer than 40 words, that's pretty complex for everybody. And if you can imagine, 40 words, and we do find 40-word sentences and things that we can give our students at higher levels, you kind of lose track of what the sentence is. Unfamiliar topic. Yeah, assuming that you know something that you don't know. Very specific academic content. Yes, these are great. Specific subject terms. Excellent. So we have qualitative features of complexity that we can assess for, looking at the background knowledge that students would need to have to unlock the text, the purpose of the text, whether it's, again, explicit, implied, the text structure. Many times we teach text structures and we teach students narrative structures, problem solution, compare, contrast. But text that we read often in life spans multiple text structures. And this has always been complex for my students, where something might start maybe with a narrative introduction, and then it moves into dense informational text that moves between definition and problem solution, and so the text structures, depending on how many and how familiar your students are, language features, including vocabulary, including sentence structure, sentence types, and illustrations and graphics. Again, students sometimes see a graphic and they might think, oh, that's great, but I'm just going to focus on the words. And sometimes the graphic just is an add-on. It's just there. And sometimes there's information presented in a graphic, either through a caption, or if it is visual information like a chart or a graph, that's actually information that's meant to be added to whatever's there in the text. So we do have to teach our students how to navigate those illustrations and graphics. So many of you landed on it. Language features is the area where the majority of complexity happens, and it comes through complex sentences and unknown or uncommon vocabulary. Doesn't mean the other ones won't be complex, or even in some cases more complex in a particular text. Depends on the text, depends on your students. And finally, we have to think, and I think we just do this so naturally, reader and task consideration. This is where we bring our own students in. And we can find a text that we think is amazing and that, and fits really well within what we want to teach. And the students may have very little motivation or may not see it as relevant. And so in that case, we have to build motivation, or sometimes we may have to choose something different. We consider the knowledge that students have, if we've built the knowledge necessary, or if we have to work on developing that, their prior experiences, and the purpose of the task and the complexity. What are we asking students to do with the text? So we can take a very simple text and ask students to do some really big thinking about it. In the same way, we can take a really complex task and ask students to do pretty simple thinking. If we take a very complex task and we're asking very literal right there questions, that doesn't necessarily make it difficult. The text may be difficult, but the thinking we're asking students to do. So we have to think about all these pieces. So what happens when students are always reading lower level texts or texts that are right in their comfort area? Well, there are times we need to do that, right? Depending on what we're working with. When I am working with my students on developing rate and prosody with fluency, I want them to know the text well enough and be comfortable enough with the text to focus on expression and speed. It really depends. But when we expose our students to lower level texts, they end up reading substantially fewer in context words. And with a lot of publishers, whether they're online platforms or print publishers, a lot of times lower level texts don't have many critical thinking questions, or they don't build to some higher order thinking, which of course our adults are quite capable of. There are fewer opportunities for discussion. There's not necessarily as much meat there. And there are fewer opportunities to write. There just isn't as much input. So we need to consider these things, and the fact that if we are generally giving our students that lower level, maybe that in that nice independent area where they're comfortable and can read the entire text first time through, that is going to result in some fewer opportunities to build skills. So when we give them opportunities to read more complex text, they are exposed to greater knowledge demands. So the concepts, the level of vocabulary is going to be increased. The linguistic demands are increased. So they're dealing with more word types. They're dealing with words that might have multisyllable words. Sentence types, they're going to be engaging with a variety of sentence types, and they're going to be, engaging with long sentences, short sentences. For example, when you look at language demands for the language standards in the CCRS, when students need to start writing sentences writing compound sentences, using and or but or so or yet, we want to expose them to compound sentences in text before they need to start creating them writing. I'm not sure, it might have been Kylene Beers who said students aren't going to write what they've never seen. So we may actually get them reading text with sentence structures they're not yet writing, but we want to definitely expose them to that. And also text structure and cohesion, transitions, those relationships between ideas are much stronger. And they often are more motivating and seem to have greater relevance for students, depending on what the student goals are. This is one of the reasons that I'm convinced that we can take students who do struggle with reading, who end up making some great gains if they're in a career pathway class, for example. The text might be complex for them, but they are greatly motivated and they see the relevance of learning that text because it has to do directly with a career pathway that they're interested in. But this webinar that I attended brought up a good point. And teachers will often say, I can't give students texts that are too hard for them to read. And no, we can't, okay? Our goal is not to frustrate our students, but we can mediate difficult texts for students. In the past, we may have changed text. I've done it. I've replaced certain vocabulary words with easier synonyms, shortened sentences, added headings where there weren't headings, taken out sentences that I didn't think needed to be there. There's a lot of things that I've done. But we can also differentiate by changing what we actually do with the text, not changing the text itself. The key is productive struggle. We talk about productive struggle all the time with the standards. Productive struggle with support. That's where reading gains can really happen. We'll talk a little bit more. So I think this is fascinating. And you can play a game with something like Lexile. Newsela does it quite well. I love Newsela. But have any of you ever noticed that if you look at the different Lexile levels, and as the Lexile levels get easier, if you look at the text doesn't necessarily get easier. The text starts missing things that can actually make the text seem harder. Has anyone, please put in the chat box if you've ever noticed that about Newsela, because Newsela typically has 5 Lexiled versions of an article. And that's because we can change the word frequency count. We can change sentence length. We can split up compound and complex sentences into simple sentences. We can make sure we get rid of all the multisyllable words, or maybe more than just compound words. doesn't automatically make the text more comprehensible. You can get a lower quantitative score, but you might actually be making the text more difficult for students. So when we only focus on the linguistic features and simplifying those, we might get rid of elements that actually make the content, it removes the meaning that the writer intended, or actually increases the complexity of trying to put ideas together. Here's a great example of that. What is Newsy LA? It is a partially free, partially pay website online. It's Newsy LA. I think Patsy or Lindsay can drop it in the chat box. It's a great source for text, particularly current news. And it comes one particular text comes in multiple Lexile levels, usually like a 2nd grade and like a 5th grade and a 7th grade and a 9th, and then maybe a max of 11th or 12th grade. And it can be great if you're working with multiple levels. But here's a great example when you just play. Thank you. And anyone, if you can answer questions for your colleagues on this webinar, please put in the chat box. So here's a great example. Okay, just taking the sentence for what it is. Because he had to work at night to support his family, Paco often fell asleep in class. Now, don't think about a particular level of students. Clearly, for a low beginning ESL, this would be really very too complex of a sentence. And for a high adult secondary, it would be easy. Don't think of that. Just look at the sentence for the sentence and put in the chat box, what are complex aspects of this single sentence that students could potentially struggle with? The subject isn't the first word. Oh boy, that right there is a big one. The placement of the word because, yes. Other characteristics that make this sentence potentially complex. The comma, absolutely. We have a complex sentence here. And the person's name, Paco, absolutely. If that's not familiar to students. There are some complexities here. We've got a lot of phrases. We've got prepositional phrases. We've got an infinitive verb phrase. We've got an adverb. We've got a subordinating conjunction with because. There's some stuff going on here, right? So say we simplify this, okay, for our students. It's in a text we want to use. We decide to simplify it. And say we simplify it like this. Paco had to make money for his family. Paco worked at night. He often went to sleep in class. So now we have greatly reduced the quantitative complexity. So Lexile comes back and it says, wow, this was, in a text that was 600 Lexile and now it's 300 Lexile. What is the possible problem that you see here in simplifying? You know what, there are only 11 of us here, so feel free to unmute yourself as well. What changed that might be so it paints a little different picture of Paco, possibly, right? It says he often went to sleep in class. But what's missing, as Tracy says in the chat box, it doesn't give the reason. It's just that he falls asleep in class. So to present this to students, the intention of the text was to show that Paco's working at night. He's supporting his family. And because he's working at night and not getting much sleep, he's falling asleep in class, which is a lot different than saying Paco had to make money for his family. Oh, and he worked at night. Paco worked at night. He often went to sleep in class. Now, not saying that as teachers, we couldn't say, draw their attention to that and say, well, how might these sentences be connected? But there's something that's being lost there when we just focus on simplifying those linguistic features. So when we talk about Lexile levels, the question gets posed, and I remember when Patsy and I were originally doing trainings on text complexity way back in like 2015 and 2016, a lot of teachers said, well, but a lot of these complex texts, my students aren't necessarily planning to go to college or go into, post-secondary training, which is fair because we have students who have a variety of goals. However, when studies have been done looking at just the workplace and citizenship, and we're talking thousands and thousands of different documents in a wide variety of career paths, and also just papers, documents, quantitative info, your property tax statement, your something coming home from school, a pamphlet in the doctor's office, voting information. And then we look at high school, and high school, when textbooks have been examined, comes in at about 1130 as an average. And citizenship and workplace texts come in higher on average. So this doesn't necessarily have to do with students having a goal of going to college. Many of our students, who've come from other countries have gone to college. But we're talking about life texts. And we have all kinds of different purposes for reading, but students do need to have that productive struggle. And we want students to be able to access complex texts of citizenship in the workplace. I'm not going to read all of these things, but certainly if any of you have ever seen any of the OSHA warnings that they have, that the lowest level line worker is supposed to be reading and understanding in a factory, the consumer information, right? Employee manuals, forms, instructions. And I know because I have had this conversation before with students who've said, well, in many cases at work, for example, there is somebody, that I know, or there's somebody who works on my line, for example, in the factory who can translate for me, or my kids often help me with those things, or other friends. And I say, great. But there's also an aspect of independence that happens here. And I never really understood that until I lived in another country and had limited language. I had some, but I was limited. And to have been a highly independent person in my 20s here in the United States, and then to have to rely on people for everything was very difficult for me. And so I think that we have to balance that with our students have different supports in place, but we also want to keep in mind, helping them to be as independent as possible. So we're going to do a little breakout group activity here. And let's see, Patsy, how many are we looking at here?
So I think I'll just make 2 rows, then we'll do 4 in each one.
That's excellent. So this is what we're going to do. And Patsy was kind enough to put the questions in the chat box. So what I want you to do is I want you to just look at these 3 questions. So if there are 4 in each group, I guess everybody gets a couple minutes. And I believe we'll have 7 minutes plus a 60-second warning. So what is a challenging text you taught recently? And why did you choose, or how did you choose it? Did you choose it based on student interest? Did you choose it because it came from a resource that you use or a core text? What did you do to mediate the complexity? It doesn't mean that you rewrote it, but maybe you did some pre-teaching, right? Or you used some activity, a go-to activity to help support the students. But I want everyone to talk about, and that text might be visual, it might be a video, it might be an image, it might be a document in a career pathway class. Text can be anything that a student can read. So go ahead.
All right. All right, take it away, Kristine.
Welcome back. I hope that you had an opportunity to do some good sharing and maybe to meet a few new people that you hadn't met before. And think about some of the things that you talked about as far as strategies for mediating the text. We're going to talk about some, and I'm sure that some on the list are ones that you talked about. But so let's talk a little bit about text complexity support. So we're talking about close reading. This is one purpose for reading among many, many different reasons that we have students read. And so close reading is really about reading and rereading a text. And this doesn't have to be a long text. It can be 5 paragraphs long. I often have done a close reading with one particularly dense paragraph that's part of a longer piece. I've even taken a really rich, complex sentence that I know my students are struggling with, and we've done a close read breaking down that sentence. So think in terms, a close read doesn't have to be a lengthy process. Students often are annotating. That might be highlighting. That might be them underlining or circling words they're not sure of. That might be drawing arrows between a pronoun and then drawing an arrow to its antecedent. If we're doing some in-text grammar, it might be coding and writing a question mark, right? On a place they have a question or an exclamation point when they've just read something they didn't know and they think is really interesting. Answering text-dependent questions, but not only text-dependent questions. It can also be completing any task that's asking students to unpack the text on different layers. Paying close attention, not only to details, main idea, but also individual words and syntax and how ideas are developing and the different text structures and the transitional words and phrases, point of view and tone. And then drawing conclusions, making connections to previous learning, to other texts, the text to world connections, building knowledge, comparing and evaluating. This would be after multiple reads. And the focus is more on the text and less on personal connections. We want students to really be going back in and digging into that text for evidence. We talk about close reading when we do close reading in terms of 3 layers. And so a first read is a great place for students to really kind of wrestle with, what does the text say? And this would be the first 3 anchors of the reading strategies, really getting at key ideas and details. What is the overall idea? What are some of the specific details in there? Layer 2, how does the text work? So looking at the craft and structure of a writer, and getting at, why did the writer use a particular word? Why did the writer choose to start or introduce the topic in this way, followed by maybe a text structure the student didn't expect? Looking at what the text means. So integrating ideas, doing some of the inferencing, integrating it with existing knowledge. And this can be done on a visual. Students can, what does the visual, what does the photograph or the image say to you? How does the photographer or the artist present the image? I mean, how does it work? What do you see? What does it mean? What do we think that the creator, the photographer, the painter meant for us to see? Think as each layer being an opportunity for students to reread with a different purpose or perspective. The more familiar a student is with a text, the higher we can push them into higher levels. And it was really Patsy several years ago who said it to me, and I've never forgotten it. She talked about, instead of jumping from text to text to text, stick with the text and do multiple activities. I think her exact words were, instead of using 10 different texts, do 10 things with one text. And is that right?
That's exactly it. Thank you.
And it has always stuck with me, because the more students become familiar, we can push them into the inferencing, into looking. I worked with someone who taught low-level ESL students, and she was challenged that a low-level ESL student can't answer a tone question. And she said, wait, she had a very simple text that was actually a funny text, but the students might not know initially until they dug in and they worked with the vocabulary and they worked on comprehending the main idea and the details and, some of these pieces. By the time she asked them the question, which was a tone question, she didn't say, what is the tone? She said, is the text funny? Why or why not? Students had the ability, they understood the text well enough to decide whether or not at that point. It's a simple example, but we don't throw that at students necessarily right away. We want to build up to that if we're doing close reading. So what is the sweet spot for close reading? Well, we have independent text where students can understand 95% or more of the words. They're not really struggling. It's pretty much right there for them to understand, as opposed to a text that students would have to rely solely on a teacher. Like they can't, or they have a dictionary. It's me trying to read a page out of Russian literature. It's been a long time since I studied Russian in college. I'd be looking up almost every word with a dictionary. That is too hot. The sweet spot is that students can understand with support. We can set them up and we can give them some scaffolds so that they are able to make meaning or to productively struggle with that text. That's that sweet spot. And when the College and Career Readiness Standards first came out, and no doubt this also was when the Common Core, which was the predecessor, the pendulum swung really far one way. And what we swung to was, when doing a close reading, don't do any pre-teaching. Put the student in cold and let the student wrestle with the text. And that, for those of us who've been in education for a while, we know, I would say just alive for a while, when a new idea comes out, a pendulum tends to swing one way or the other. And we saw a lot of references to not doing any pre-teaching, no background. Let's put them into the text cold. And it was this Newton's cradle here, right? Like everything we know about providing background knowledge was just shot right out because we have to put students in the text cold. And we had all kinds of really interesting conversations. And of course, I worked with Patsy a lot then. And Patsy said, whoa, 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 English language learners, I'm sorry, but there needs to be equity and we need to make sure everyone can jump into that text. And she was, like Patsy often is, correct. So the real question for me then became not if we should pre-teach before close reading, but how much should we pre-teach? Okay, we know we have to, but how much background knowledge do we provide? How much pre-teaching and what kinds? Because the bottom line is that all students need access. Access doesn't mean all students are going to jump into it and understand every part of it. It means access, right? They can get through the door when close reading. And because whether you're in a one-room schoolhouse or you're in a leveled classroom, I've heard people say, if you have more than one student in front of you, more than one adult student, you have a multi-level class. So we need to keep that in mind. But the majority of instruction should be focused on students working with the text itself, not pre-teaching. That was something I was terribly guilty of for a long time in teaching. We spent a lot of time in pre-teaching and much less time in the actual text. So I want you to do a Menti here. Patsy's going to put in the chat box the information that you need to go to www.menti.com. If you haven't used this before, you're going to get a box and you need to enter a code. And that code is here, 3376157. And this is a finger slide scale. I love to use these with students with learning targets, where it says, I can use a comma before a coordinating conjunction, and then they can slide it. It's a great little formative assessment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here so that we can see live. From no or little pre-teaching all the way to I've pretty much gotten rid of all the complexity or the majority of the complexity. Take your finger and drag it. It's anonymous. It can also depend, I know, depending on what you're trying to teach, but in general, if you're going to be using a new text on a topic with students, where do you tend to be? And this is just going to give us an average. See, a couple of you did it. Lindsay, you can do it too. I know you're not teaching now, but think back. So we're leaning a little bit more towards no or little pre-teaching. Oh, Lindsay, if anyone else having the same issue, Lindsay, could you come on and talk and just briefly explain what's going on?
Yeah, maybe maybe it's just me, but I tried it on my computer and my phone and I'm like, it's not working on either place, but it is. So it's because it's a 3-point scale. It's either it's going to stay at the 1 dot, or you have to click the middle for 2, or you can go all the way to the right for 3. So anyways.
Thank you, Lindsay. And that's fine, Tracy. No problem. Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have said that. If you use this with students, you can have like 3 points, 1, 2, 3. You can also go to 5. I tend to stay away from 5 because it starts to, like I sort of kind of agree. I sort of kind of don't agree. I mostly agree. All right. Wait for one more. Looks like we're kind of in the middle, which actually is excellent because, and again, it's we always are going to have times when we need less or more. All right. All right. Thank you. Just to get you thinking a little bit. And I used to definitely be more over to the reduces most or all complexity side. I didn't reduce all the complexity, but I was one of those teachers who was like, okay, so I'm going to pre-teach you 12 words, vocabulary words. And I wouldn't actually look into the text and go, wow, could students figure out, are there clear context clues? Maybe I should hold off on those and have students work with those. But here are some key points. So we want students to read along a continuum of text levels. We want them to be reading. They're going to be reading easy text, right? If we're teaching a reading strategy, or they're practicing, they're practicing decoding, or we just want them to read because it's fun to read or it's inspiring. Then we also want students to be reading more on the higher end. We talk a lot about frustration, right? Because we've talked for many, many years about independent level, instructional level, frustration level. And frustration level is what students can read and understand with no supports. When we give students a CASAS test, or we give students a TABE test, the score they get is a frustration level. We've pushed them as far as they can go. That is not necessarily where students can be successful. I notice this always with the math tests, it's the same. Students would say, well, I got this on the math test. And my colleague Andy would say, that doesn't mean that you're actually ready to be doing math there. We need to pull back a little bit and do some instruction back. So when we provide essential background knowledge and we integrate effective instructional strategies, that's productive struggle. Very different from frustration level, where we're giving them something and telling them, go away, good luck with that. That is not what we're talking about. But we do know that reading gains happen this way. And close reading is one purpose. It is not the sole focus of reading. Pre-teaching should be less than the time spent working with the actual text. So, a couple things to consider. Determine whether to activate prior knowledge, build background knowledge, or both. Recently, I've done some observation of teachers, and a few of the teachers just jumped right in. They said, okay, so I'm going to pre-teach X, Y, and Z. And I said, well, did you do anything to find out? Like, what do your adults know? I mean, there might be some students who know a little something about that, or students might actually know some of those words. And in that case, you want to activate, right? And find out, what maybe we need to fill in. We often do both. What do they already have? What do they need? We want to decide what's essential to provide access to the text. So students don't have to know everything about a topic to get into a text. And we want to focus on information that's not given in the text, that the writer doesn't provide. We want to unlock it. Somebody told me this, and this really stuck with me. No spoilers. If it's there and students can work with it, maybe hold off on it and give them a task that has them unpack. There's a difference between core background knowledge versus incidental knowledge. I used to, obviously, there's so many connections that students can make, and we want them to be curious, but we also need to realize that there is a core that can help them unlock and be able to do more work. We want to activate or teach critical background knowledge. So if you want to provide it, these are things you might do. You might use short, easier text, or you might create a text as a teacher. You might use a video clip or images. You might pre-teach maybe 3 to 5 keywords that really are like absolutely essential to the central idea and don't have context clues that students can maybe work with. If you want to activate, discussions are great. Having students do predicting activities, having them do little quick writes, or give them sentence starters to turn to their neighbor and talk about what they might know about a topic. Knowledge rating tools for those of you where you give them a list of vocabulary, key vocabulary, and have them rate themselves as far as what level they know the word. Self-assessments and KWL, these are all great ways to activate background knowledge. And be concise. Again, less time pre-teaching versus time spent working with the actual text. We want them to spend time in that text. That's why when we do close reading, we need rich texts that have multiple layers, that can sustain multiple reads and multiple activities. We can provide background knowledge in our pre-teaching, or we can embed it in instruction. And we want to keep it essential when close reading. Okay, again, we're talking about close reading with complex text. So what so far resonates with you, and what are you puzzling over? If you take a moment in the chat box. So we've talked about pre-teaching, but then we talked about text complexity. You had some conversation in small groups, talking about a text you've recently taught, the idea of simplifying texts. What is something that resonates? You only have to answer one that resonates or that you're puzzling over. Yeah, I mean, our students, right? That's why we love to teach adults. The knowledge, the life experience, what they come in with is just, it's so rich. And we want to sometimes not just assume they don't know something. We want to try to activate other things that resonate with you or that you're puzzling over. I know I'm throwing a lot of things at you, but you will get a copy of the slide deck. To not pre-teach all the vocabulary to my beginning ESL learners. Encourage independence. I'm so happy sometimes. It's I don't always get Patsy on my webinars, but Patsy, you said that sometimes you would pre-teach. You made that comment, and I appreciated that comment when you worked with your ESL learners. You're working with beginning ESL learners. What's fair to pre-teach when it comes to the vocabulary?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think your suggestions are solid, right? Like, what do they actually need to know in order to get the gist of what's happening. And then I think part of it for me was just getting some comfort with the fact that my students didn't actually need to know every word in a text to move through it and to get something out of it. And I think sometimes newer teachers in particular get very stuck. It's like, well, they don't know that word. It's like, do they need to know that word? It might be okay. Like you might let that one go. So really thinking and prioritizing, like, what are the elements in the text that without which it will just be lost or could take someone in a whole different direction. So it helped me like prioritize, I guess, and like triage a little bit of a text. Like, what are the 5 things that if students don't get, we're not going to be able to, this isn't going to be helpful. It's not going to be worthy of their time. And I think that's what it comes down to is our students are busy, they're adults, they're adulting hard. Like, what is worthy of their time and attention and focusing there. But I was definitely guilty of pre-teaching so much that I barely needed to look at it. So
thank you. And thank you. I think that makes such good sense, you know, and I know that my students can get a lot of anxiety, or my students have had a lot of anxiety in the past. My GED level students, like, I have to learn all the vocabulary. What if I'm reading a passage on the GED and I don't know all the vocabulary? And I said, you're not going to necessarily, and you're going to have to, we're going to work on high frequency words and work on some word attack strategies. And together, hopefully that will give you, that will give you what you need. I see a puzzle here, hitting the sweet spot in a class with a range of reading skills. Yeah. And Susan, I've done a lot of reading recently about how we can scaffold hundreds of Lexile levels actually in a mixed level group, as long as all of the readers have mastered decoding skills. If you've got beginning readers, emerging readers, beginning ESL learners, and you've got high intermediate readers, you're not going to be able to scaffold that, right? Because there are very specific needs. But once students have some elementary reading levels and they have mastered decoding, or pretty much mastered, they're still going to probably struggle with some multisyllable words, then you have a fighting chance, depending on the supports that you use and how you create those supports to work with a single text. And I'll give you some examples for scaffolding. Thank you so much for the things you're resonating with. Productive struggle. Lindsay and I have done webinars where teachers say, I don't like it when my students struggle. And of course we, no. And a lot of times students, we have to create that culture. Jessica Jones from Literacy Minnesota has talked about that. You have to create that culture, right? But high cognitive expectations, that's actually part of building a respectful learner environment, because we're not asking them to just throw themselves off a cliff. We're asking them, I think about like when I was a kid, and you couldn't do this now, but they'd put us, I was born in 70, they put us on the high board at the pool and they'd say, jump off. And I was one of those kids who just bawled and said, I'm not jumping off this. It was 11 feet up and it might as well have been 50 feet. And they pushed us off. Right? Wouldn't do that now, but there was somebody right underneath the board ready to catch us. And I'm not saying that we want to shove our students off of an 11-foot, who can't swim, but I'm saying that we're guiding them, right? We're not leaving them. I know. I mean, those of us who, grew up in the 70s and the 80s know that there's so many things that would never fly now.
That would not go over very well. It was not what happened in Omaha, Kristine. I don't know.
That is what happened in South St. Paul. They just shoved you with both hands. So let's talk scaffolding. Again, in the chat box, or please, feel free to unmute. What is a scaffold you use to support students? Like, what's a go-to scaffold? It might be a pre-teaching scaffold, right? It might be something that you do, or they piggybacked us on the back of a senior V. That is hilarious. Or something that when students are reading, it might be a technique, it might be a strategy. What's kind of a go-to scaffold that you like to use? Go ahead and unmute if you want to. I know KWL is always popular. I love KWL, but I always forgot that you go back to it, right? And as you're working through and you're answering some of your questions and new questions are coming up, to go back and to continually work. I never did that. That was not that was something, my follow through wasn't the best. KWL. I'm going to kick this back to the group. What's KWL? The quiet group. They're very thoughtful.
They're typing maybe.
KWL, Tracy. Ha!
It is.
Thank you, Lindsay. What do I know? What do I want to know? What did I learn? That's the most basic of KWL. KWL charts can take all kinds of forms, but it's a way to, like, it's 3-column graphic organizer. You can do it like on a whiteboard or on flip chart paper with the class. Like, here's the topic that we're going to read about. What do I know? And you can list all the things that students know. What do I want to know? And then the class can come up, or the student can come up with some questions. And then looking back, some of those questions might be answered. Some of them might not be answered, but looking back and saying, were any of our questions answered? It's a great way to activate prior knowledge.
Thinking with lower level students, I would often show a photograph or a visual of some kind that had something to do with the text we were about to read, just as a way of sort of getting our heads into the subject that was at hand. And then you can do some pretty kind of predetermined elicitation questions like, oh, what is this guy carrying? Have you ever carried something like that? And then you find out that the text is about a briefcase or something. So, but it's helpful to start with a visual. It doesn't require a lot of reading to get students talking first.
And Susan, I know when you were at Language and Literacy Institute, you love to use images, and you always find such wonderful images for your science class. They absolutely, images with higher level students can be a blast, and they can be incredibly helpful. Anyone else? I love that, Lindsay, to provide the context in which the text sits. Yeah. Math problems. How many of you read aloud? Do you read aloud a text first to kind of help scaffold and make it more accessible to learners? I would do that. Patsy and I were talking before the webinar. I taught a class of all Liberian students whose oral language skills were considerably higher than their print. They really didn't have many print reading skills. So I would always start and I would read aloud once or twice, and they could work with a more complex text than they ever could in print because they were accessing it in a way that they could understand. Yes, Vicki says yes. Melissa, yes. Higher level, but also working on English. Is that supposed to be love or lower? Oh, love to read aloud. We read the text together, then I read it. So again, bringing students, reading it together as a class, not having them just jump into it, reducing some of that complexity so they can follow along. Because a lot of times they'll hear a word and they'll say, oh, my Liberian students would always say, oh, that's what that word looks like, because they knew it orally, but they didn't know it in print, and that helps reduce complexity. So very, very briefly, for many of us who learned to be reading teachers a while ago, we talked a lot about leveled reading. So this idea that we want to find that instructional level for students, and that's really a key area to be working with students. And so there were all these getting leveled readers and having them, take tests to find out exactly where they were at. Versus scaffolded reading, which is where we take something that is going to potentially be complex and we're going to actually support them in working with that complexity. So just a quick comparison chart. And again, I want to remind you, this applies to students who are already reading at elementary levels and have mastered decoding skills. At lower levels, those students have very specific needs. And so we're talking about students who have acquired some reading skills. When we talk about leveled reading versus scaffolded reading, there really isn't an evidence base. It feels like there is an evidence base for leveled reading, but when you really dig into the research, there's not. A lot of people have run with it over the years and written about it, and curriculum publishers have developed curriculum, but there's very little research, as opposed to considerable research that shows that students make real gains if they're given opportunities to work with complex text and scaffolds. Expectations of the students, sometimes it can lead us to unintentionally reduce expectations. The choice of text can be limited, and it's hard to determine what a student's exact reading level is. We may have a CASA score, we may have a TABE score. They might be they might have a functioning level, an NRS functioning level, but their ability to read a text is also going to depend on the kind of text, right? My students can read narrative structures all day long, but I put them into a piece of really dense informational text at the same approximate grade level that the narrative text was, and they struggle, right? So it's not as easy to find that sweet spot. When we scaffold, it opens up the type of reading we can have. The text can be driven by value and quality of the text as well. And the student growth is often limited to what a student can read without support, as opposed to taking advantage of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, which is, I can do more if you're there to kind of help guide me and help give me the tools to do what I need to do. So what can happen, and this unfortunately is the reality of adult basic ed. When you're working with a lot of students and you have to give students independent work, then we tend to give them work. Sometimes we want to give them something that by themselves at home they can work on and be productive with. But we have to balance that out, because if that's what we're doing, we need to make sure that students are occasionally getting that opportunity to stretch themselves. Thank you, Susan, for your clarification. So some examples of scaffolding complex text: pre-teaching key vocabulary concepts or grammar structures. I've seen teachers pre-teach if there's a particular grammar structure. Maybe there are a lot of complex sentences, a lot of adjective clauses. Maybe I've seen an example of text that had a lot of uses of this, that, these, and those. And, and having students like do a mini this, that, these, and those lesson so that they could track. Having a clear purpose, using an apprentice text and visuals, reading a passage aloud, and giving them a model of fluent reading, defining and highlighting transition words or pronouns and their antecedents. So helping students with that, or asking them to draw the arrows or note transitional words. Provide partially completed graphic organizers, fill part of it in, or use sentence stems or frames in the graphic organizer. Use excerpts of text. Give students one paragraph or sentence at a time. I've seen mixed groups where the higher level students are doing some close reading questions based on the whole text, where some of the students who aren't quite as high level are working on close reading a single paragraph of that text. So they're doing something smaller. Dig into juicy sentences. This is not my idea, but when you take a sentence and you guide students through, asking them questions like, what do some of the words mean? Let's take a look at this clause. Where's your subject? What is the pronoun? Break it down. Do a close read of a sentence. Activities that have different that focus students on different perspectives. Provide sentence or paragraph frames for students to use when speaking or writing about the text. Add notes or questions. I used to put stop signs, I used to draw one before I knew how to insert that visual. I would put a stop sign, and then they look like every time to stop, I want you to write down 1 or 2 key words from that section. Summarize as you go. Write key ideas. The support activities should be designed around what makes the text complex. And remember, that's not only what the text presents itself as, just the text itself without thinking of any students, the complex features, but also then what you determine for your particular group are going to be complex features. That's where we design those support activities around. So text sets. Do any of you use multiple texts around a topic or an essential question? I'm going to kind of blend this together. If you've built around an essential question or a big chunky question or topic recently, please go put that in the chat box. And if you've used multiple texts, multiple means more than one. And when I say that, I could mean maybe something, a passage, and you combine it with a video, or you combine it with some images, or just text, more than one text. How do you use multiple texts? Or how are you building around an essential question? And if you're not fully sure what an essential question is, that's okay too. We're going to talk briefly about that. It's the last topic for this webinar. One of the standards in the reading anchors is that students are reading more than one text on a similar topic. One of the easiest ways I found to do that was using a text and then pulling in some visual information. I would find a chart or a graph that had to do with that information, and I would work that in. That's another text. So as you're thinking, text sets are curated sequences of resources. The goal is to build knowledge and complexity around a topic or an essential question. Yes, pick 2 or 3, vary the type of text, graphic, text, video, absolutely. Music, art, real life text. Essential questions, they're open-ended, they're thought-provoking, they can be ambiguous, which, students aren't always fully comfortable with that. But there's a value in looking at topics that actually create more questions. Students need to build some knowledge up in order to be able to answer the question, or they need they need enough knowledge to be able to apply. It guides the activities that we choose to do, and it guides the text that we use. Some examples, I'll just point out a few. What does it mean to be healthy? What should the government increase the minimum wage? This is one that I used back when I was preparing students for the GED. What is the relationship between freedom and responsibility? There are so many wonderful essential questions. You can Google essential questions and usually come up with some great lists. And that's what makes a community a good place to live. So creating a text set often means we grab at least one traditional text. So it's something, it might come from a resource that we're using, a textbook or a core text or Newsela or Common Lit. And we want to have a range in difficulty if we choose more than one. Having a digital text, getting them looking maybe at a blog, at a website. We want to mediate the difficulty and the difference of online text. So obviously when students are reading online, there are a lot of distractions, right? And so depending on the students, we may need to talk and clarify, like, this is not actually part of the text, right? This is an advertisement. This is a video. You don't need to click on this. Videos, great support for students who have greater oral vocabulary. It's great listening practice or for classes with multiple levels. Graphics, it's an additional format and it's a real life skill. Our students need to be creative or critical thinkers and critical readers of quantitative info. Are essential questions always questions that have multiple answers and viewpoints? I would say yes, the best ones are. It's something that you can't just say yes or no. I mean, they're not a yes or a no question. So when I used to teach high school students and I used to build around, is the death penalty justifiable or not? And yes, you could answer that in one, it's justifiable or not. But I'm like, no, we're going to read text. We're going to read and we're going to study opinions on both sides. And students would sometimes ask me, like, well, which is the right answer? And I said, it's not about a right answer. It's about you learning about something and deciding for yourself. These are usually very, very motivating, engaging questions. All texts are focused on that essential question. So the staircase of complexity, I put its back. I used to love using this. I designed this way back when we started with the standards. Students are working constantly in two different ways. They are working where they're at, depending on purpose. Like we want them to be working on text they can do, right? And that, depending on if they're working on fluency or they're working on decoding skills or they're working on, a reading strategy or something. But then they also we need to be taking their hand and pulling them up to the next step and the next step with giving them those opportunities. So they're right there and they're kind of going up the stairs a little bit too. And so we want to scaffold and support students. We want to choose the right kinds of text, but we don't always want to substitute the text. Sometimes we need to use the text as is. So here's a vision text set. And I'm going to show, I'm actually, I'll just do this one text set because I think you can get a really good idea from this so that I finish this on time. This is from Sabes. They are kind of like Atlas in Massachusetts, but much, much bigger. And like they have an entire group of people working on ELA and an entire group of people working on ESL and math and science. And so they've developed a few text sets, and I loved this one. This one, they didn't present it like this. It was just a list of links, but I really started to dig through it and I gave it an essential question, which is how does eyesight work and how do we protect it? So if we look at some of the texts that they chose, here's a short video. It introduces some vocabulary that's going to appear in other texts about the topic. It's full of lovely visuals that reinforce the info. It would be a really nice place to start. Then there was this Kids Health. It's a website. Again, we have a lot of parents. It could, be motivating for that, but there's a good, they may not know all of these words. They may not know vitreous humor, but it's a nice visual and there's an audio option and it's got an explanation of how the eye works. Then there was another video. It was short, very clear diagrams. This had to do with nearsighted and farsighted, which is going to probably be applicable to many of our learners. The goal of a text set isn't that you use every single text, but that you have a choice. And depending on the group in front of you, you're going to choose what am I going to start with? What am I going to follow it up with? Moving into another individual vision plans. This is a website. It's authentic info. It does reinforce the previous video on some nearsightedness and provides some additional details, very visual. This is another short video that would be maybe complex to start with, but at this point, there's quick and easy info. They're going to be familiar with some of these terms, and it happens to be a great background knowledge builder for this short video, which reinforces previous content. It's done as a news story, so that format may be more familiar to students. WebMD. This is a website that a lot of people use. Your students may very well be familiar with it. Again, it reinforces previous info, provides even more details. There's links for additional research if your students are doing that. Here's a great video more on a global level that looks at eye care in other countries. And it's a great place for adults to be like, oh, wow. So what is, vision care like in other places compared to the vision care that we've had here? And then finally, you can even go, this is Warby Parker. They sell glasses, but they also have this, this really engaging part of their website where they donate millions and millions of glasses to help people around the world. And it's very kind of inspiring, and it could certainly be part of this text set. I'm going to, if you just hold on here a second. What I want to do is, and the other text set will be in here, but what I want to do is just briefly, you can choose an essential question and then choose a variety of texts to build knowledge and vocabulary. And you can spend some time, multiple lessons on this. Consider the sequence of text in terms of building complexity. You may, with one particular group, you might start in one place, but then the next time you use it, maybe next year or the second part of the year, you have a group that has a little different background knowledge. You might start with a different one. Determine how students will interact. Each of these texts you can create. activities for, whether they're questions or whether they're speaking and listening activities, whether they're using graphic organizers. That's the part that as the teacher, you decide how you want them to work with text. And I want to make sure I get us here. So we've talked about quite a few things here today about text complexity, about why it's important for our learners that they get opportunities to engage with text complexity, and that the productive struggle is something that is meaningful and useful for students. We don't want them to be in an eternal state of productive struggle, but we want them to have access to that. We want to think about pre-teaching, when we need to activate, when we need to build, and then how do we keep that to really the essentials, right? All the different scaffolds that we can use that can help us to reduce complexity and bring access without always simplifying or doing too much pre-teaching. If we get to the point where students don't even really need to read the text, that's when we need to pull back a little bit. We can always stop when we're reading, and we can always say, okay, that's happened to me. I didn't think we'd have trouble with this word. It looks like this word is problematic. Let's stop for a moment and let's talk about what this word means. We can always do that. And we want to think about how we can look at text sets. A text set could be 3 texts, where the first one is fairly easy, right? And that's actually going to serve as a bridge to reading the next text, or hearing or watching the next text. And then to maybe the highest of the texts is the final text, that third text. But students we've filled in some of that background knowledge that they need. So what's a takeaway today? And a need that you still have? One of the things that I noticed that I was doing was I was going back through texts that I love to teach, and I was finding that I was moving them around a little bit. So there were some texts where I'm like, you know what? Actually, this would be a better text to start with. Like, I can get students reading a higher text, but you know what? I'm going to change this text around a little bit. Or, you know what? This text just isn't going to work for close reading. It just isn't meaty enough, right? I'm going to use this for another purpose, and I'm going to try to find a different text. Lindsay, the difference between scaffold and leveled reading: less pre-teaching, more productive struggle. We have our hearts. Think about where our hearts are as teachers. We want to support our students in every way possible. I think about climbing a mountain, right? I think about, we can either say, look, you can't do that. You can't climb that mountain. Or we can carry them on our backs, right? We don't want to do that, right? We want to give them the right tools. We want to give them tools, and we want to walk beside them, right? We want to walk with them so they get to the top of the mountain, because that is also where we can turn around. And Patsy loves to say this too. We can do hard things. And we tell our students, the work we did, this was tough work. You're doing it. And that really builds some self-efficacy. Thank you, Tracy. Less pre-teaching, more productive struggle. Metaphor, nice metaphor. Any questions as we are wrapping up? So any more a need you have or a takeaway? Want to remind you, we've got the Every Webinar series going on. We still have fluency and comprehension coming up. These have been just a blast on Fridays with Martin Frank and her various co-presenters. Patsy is dropping links in the box. Tiffy Tuesdays, dig in to the ACES TIFF work. I always say that the ACES TIFF is what is the foundation that we build so that our students can do the work of the CCRS standards. We've got another CCRS support webinar coming up, evaluating CCRS alignment of lessons, units, and resources. We've recently revamped some tools that we developed several years ago so that we can dig in more to looking at whether or not the materials we're using with students and the strategies are relevant and really kind of including our students and who they are in the work that we're doing. And then the big statewide virtual conference. Anything, Patsy, you want to make a quick plug for that?
It's going to be great, as it always is. So this is in lieu of regionals this spring. So we're not going out and about around the state like we did this fall. There's just one big virtual conference. It's Friday, April 28th. You'll get relicensure requirement kinds of sessions, as well as their adult career pathway strand, as well as a manager specific sessions, math, ELA, ESL, all the things. You'll be super sad if you miss it. That's what I want to say.
Thank you to Patsy for tech hosting today. Lindsay, my partner in crime, always. Thank you for attending. We will be sending out a link to the recording. This will go on the Minnesota ABE professional YouTube channel. I also will have the slides. And as always, please email me with any questions. If I don't know the answer, I will find it and I will connect you to someone who does have an answer.